On November 7th, 2017, the latest Sonic game called Sonic Forces came out, 3 months after Sonic Mania. These games were set to celebrate Sonic's anniversary at the time, with Sonic Forces being a follow-up / successor to another anniversary game called Sonic Generations. Unfortunately, once the game came out, it was met with a universal meh from the public, as it was mostly seen as a disappointing game with wasted potential. To keep this topic short, since many people already reviewed the game, I'll just summarize my own opinions about the game itself. Despite its decent character customization and replayability via the missions and unlockable achievements, the game itself is quite dull with extremely short levels, flawed gameplay controls with classic Sonic being the worst to control in my opinion, a subpar story, poor character writing, and the music to be okay at best. Interestingly enough, Sonic Forces is a game worth talking about, not because of what it is as an end product, but because it served as the main groundwork for a series of books that chronologically happened right after it. Those books are entitled under the name Sonic the Hedgehog, a comic book series published by IDW. But just out of sheer simplicity, I just call it As a casual Sonic fan with a moderately decent knowledge of said franchise, I have been reading these comics ever since they were first published back in April 2018, and I still do read them to this very day. But out of curiosity and nostalgia, I decided to buy the first volume of the comic, wanting to reread these stories, and frankly, I'm glad I did. Aside from it being a good read, I've come to appreciate how the people who work on these comics use Sonic Forces as a jumping off point to tell stories that directly tackle what it introduced, while at the same time creating new stories that directly follow from that game. Sure, it is not perfect by any means, but for what it was trying to establish, it is still astounding. However, seeing that there's a lot to cover, I have decided to split it into 2 parts, with today's video focusing on the first 6 issues, which dwells on the characters and the writing, while leaving the last 6 issues focusing on the storytelling aspects. I just find it easier for me to manage. Is it cool with y'all? Cool. Let's begin. As I previously mentioned, the characters presented in Sonic Forces to me weren't well written and executed, as they were either one note or were just so dull that I found myself bored of them. To start, many of the characters introduced in this game already had pre-established character traits that they already had thanks to the previous games they appeared in the Sonic franchise. Obviously, it varies with levels of quality with how many games they do show up in, and some of them did in fact have small rewrites based on the company's mandates and decisions. But even with that inconvenience, at least we know who they are thanks to the core personalities that they're tied up with. But in this game, it feels off, either because what they did stands in contrast to who they are,
Sonic, help me!
Or because they feel so paper thin that they feel like placeholders more than anything else. It doesn't help that the overall dialogue and pacing of the story plays out so fast, yet so empty at the same time.
Eggman's forces have chewed through our defenses at Green Hill, and the resistance in the city is reporting that whatever it is that finished Sonic. Sorry, I'm still not used to saying that. I've just received some incredible news! Sonic is alive!
As for the new characters, their biggest flaw is the fact that they're written so shallowly, almost as if they were boxed in to fit certain character archetypes. Though the avatar somewhat gets a pass, seeing that they're supposed to be standing for the player, Infinite unfortunately doesn't get a pass. Quick introduction. Infinite is the newly added character to Sonic's many roster of villains. A serious and imposing individual who wields the Phantom Ruby, a powerful gem that can affect the senses and perception of those around him, creating illusions that can harm anyone he chooses. With a character with such a cool design and premise, it would be easy to expect him to be filled with layers of complexity, or at the very least be a threatening villain. But for the most part, he falls short, as aside from proving his power, he spends the entire story trying to act as threatening rather than actually being threatening. It doesn't help that his dialogue feels hollow, and most ironic of all, his backstory in the episode Shadow Prologue turns him into a wannabe edgelord.
Pathetic. Me. He's calling me weak. No, I am not weak. I'm not weak. That day, I gave up my own unsightly face. I let go of the old me, the one that was so weak, so that I could become stronger. I've only become what I am because of you, yet you don't remember. But I suppose that's the way it goes. It simply means that the old me was too weak, too pathetic to remember.
Funny enough, the only two characters I think haven't changed for the worse are the main characters at the center of all Sonic media, Sonic and Dr. Eggman. Say what you will about Sonic's incredibly corny dialogues, in terms of who he is and how he acts, he pretty much stays consistently reading throughout the story, since his very core personality is being a carefree and daring hero with a heart of gold.
Is everyone okay?
We are, thanks to you.
And a sassy gremlin who revels in annoying his enemies.
Oh great! See, Infinite, now we're getting to know each other. So, what's your favorite color? Do you like long romantic walks on the beach? What's the source of your power? You can skip the first two questions if you like.
The source of my power is none of your concern.
Sorry, but you've just got to share the secret of your power with me. I insist.
Said could be said for Dr. Eggman, whom from beginning to end is the most consistent character through and through.
You let the hedgehog live? That is a great source of concern! Those resistance pests and their clever little plots, they're like something on your shoe that you can't wipe off. Tisk tisk. Since you always destroy the power source of my weapons, I decided to learn from my mistakes. I had a backup power source created under Metropolis.
The only criticism that I have up to that point is Sonic not showing any range of emotions aside from his usual standard. But really, it's more of a nitpick on my part than anything else. Also, side note, yes, I'm aware that we do get to know more about Infinite through a comic that came out in tandem with Sonic Forces, which add more context to who he is and his motivation. But seeing as to how minute it is very easy to overlook it. In other words, I really wish it was written in the story of Sonic Forces rather than really get it to a promotional comic. Fortunately, the IDW Sonic comics corrected these mistakes, or at the very least, faced those issues head-on on the first 6 issues I've read. For one, the writer of IDW Sonic, Ian Flynn, reuses these flaws in Sonic Forces as a new character layer to explore and further give some of the characters more depth. The obvious and easiest example would be Tails, as in the very first issue of the comic, turns his out-of-the-blue panic at the sight of Chaos Zero wanting Sonic to save him into a genuine worry that he's starting to have and needs to recognize, which is the fact that there will be a time where Sonic could potentially be gone for good, and while he is capable of fending for himself, that very potential loss did and will make him vulnerable. Another thing to point out before we continue is that looking back at the way he acted in Sonic Forces, Tails also recognizes and realizes that he would definitely need to use that as a means to better improve on what he wants to become. It is a small and quick scene, don't get me wrong, it only lasted for a page or two, but it's still cool that he tackled it nonetheless. Similarly, the same could be said for other characters like Amy. The idea of Amy being an organizer in Sonic Forces was reinforced in her character in issue 2, to show that even though yes, Amy is still the same cheerful and expressive character who falls for Sonic, she's also the same Amy who has grown and matured into the very hero she is, being the great guide to the citizens of a small town who needed to defend themselves against the rampages of a battling horde. The only character who undergoes any major changes is the main villain, Dr. Eggman, and that's only because the events that transpire in the game literally transform him into a different character entirely due to his amnesia, now donning the persona of a kind inventor called Mr. Tinker. Not to mention that there's an adage imagery in issue 5 which indicates that Dr. Eggman's amnesia could be caused by the Phantom Ruby. Meanwhile, The other characters presented in the comics such as Sonic, Knuckles, the Chaotix, Blaze, Shadow, and Rouge are somewhat written the same if not better, seeing that the game hadn't majorly changed the character in some way. Though Blaze hasn't appeared in Sonic game to my knowledge since Sonic Generations, so really she's been written just like how she's always been depicted in the games she's appeared in. Okay, sure, Knuckles being the leader of the Resistance is still mentioned, but it doesn't have any major change as Knuckles himself in issue 3 has grown tired of that role, now wanting to go back to his guardian duty. Now, there is an argument to be made about Sonic since his latest character iteration has been greatly affected by Sega's mandate, similar to Shadow as he too is affected by his own mandates implemented by Sega. But because he's more or less acts the same in both the comic and in Sonic Forces, he doesn't go through any character rewrite in the comic. He does however get an additional layer to his character, but seeing that it becomes more prevalent in issue 12 and onwards, I'd rather save that topic for another time. The same applies to Shadow, since his characterization doesn't become too noticeable until a certain issue. But for what he offers in issue 6, his effective, straight to the point but harsh nature is justified when you remember that, aside from the many atrocities that Dr. Eggman has committed, the last time he encountered him, he successfully conquered the world and made the world live in hell for his peers and allies. So in hindsight, of course his default conclusion is to rid the world of Dr. Eggman once and for all. As for the new characters, okay, it's not much since they just got introduced into the comic series. That being said, they're still worth talking about because even though they're newly introduced characters, they hold one advantage over Infinite: time. You see, the first IDW Sonic comic was planned between Sega and IDW back on July 21st, 2017 when it was first introduced. This is speculation on my part, but it's reasonable to believe, at least to me, that between July 2017 and April 2018, they had enough time to design the characters and plan out the stories that will involve them. However, for all I know, they might have planned this even before it was later announced, but my point remains. Infinite isn't a poorly executed character because he was just terribly written. He is a poorly executed character because, just like the rest of the game, it was most likely rushed, and unless we do see him in the future, his first debut will be remembered as a wannabe edgelord instead of a force to be reckoned with. On the other side of the medium, we do get to know a little bit about these newly introduced characters. Tango the Lemur, an optimistic and easily excitable loco with a prehensile tail that can stretch to great lengths, and Ruff and Tumble, broadly skunk villains who are pretty much just cartoonish bullies. They were given enough time for their conceptualization and they will have even more time to be fleshed out as the series goes on. And within the current issues that they're introducing, they are at the very least entertaining characters and at best interesting and cool characters who want my attention. And speaking of having more time to flesh out its ideas, there's so much more that this comic book has offered. Never mind the remaining few characters I've yet to talk about. As previously mentioned, there's a story being told that I would love to analyze, a bunch of small inconsequential ideas that exist in Sonic Forces that carried over to the comic in a big impactful way, and especially the short dilemma that is issues 5 and 6. But I'd rather save that for another video. Overall, it has been a good read so far in my opinion, and I highly recommend that you guys find the time to reread these comics for yourself. You will not regret it. As for Sonic Forces, I don't recommend the game unless you are either into character customization or you are looking forward to trying the highly praised Sonic Forces Overclock mod, which I don't blame you.
Thank you.